Right, well, my clock's clicked round to 11 o'clock, so let's get going. So good morning, everyone. My name's James Walsh. I'm Head of Membership Engagement here at the PLSA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Policy Insights webinar. The aim of this series of webinars is to give you, PLSA members, insights into the work that our policy team are doing on your behalf with the government, with the regulators and so on, and to give you an idea of what's coming down the track that you're going to have to deal with. Of course, climate change and responsible investing, I know, are right at the top of the agenda for local authority members, certainly all the ones that I speak to. So this event is an opportunity for us to update you on what the PLSA is doing to represent you in this area and to discuss what's coming next. We're going to hear from my colleague, Joe Dabrowski, who is our Deputy Director of Policy. He's going to present. And then we'll have some comments from Richard McIndoe, who's Director of the Strathclyde Pension Fund and also a member of our Local Authority Committee. Then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A, hopefully plenty of them, so do type them into the Q&A box and I'll put them to Joe and Richard. We're going to spend 30 minutes or so on climate change, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for a few other topics that we are working on at the PLSA, just to give you a brief overview of those. So climate change first. Joe, over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and good morning to everybody. I just wanted to quickly start with a bit of a recap on some of the work that the PLSA did last year on climate change. There's a huge amount going on in this space, and it continues to be an incredibly busy area, both kind of on a regulatory front from a legislative front as well, and also for members. And it is one of our key priorities for this year, certainly as we consider the run-up to COP later in this year, which Richard is clearly going to be very close to as a co-host city, and also with the importance of the general topic rising through investor interests. So we published the report there that's on the slide in October, and we did that following a very long period of discussion with members through the spring and the summer. We held a number of roundtables. We had over 80 schemes and more through their intermediaries and consultants, etc., who fed into the work. And what we were seeking to do during that period was to examine some of the barriers that investors face when dealing with these issues, and also where the solutions might be most necessary. I mean, in a moment, I'll kind of come on to what some of the response from government has been and how that seems to be heading in a positive direction, albeit a pretty busy one. The things that we found during those discussions were pretty consistent across our groups of members, but some of them were perhaps a little bit sharper in the LGPS space for LGPS members. And last year was a period where being very much at the kind of front end of some of the kind of campaign groups interest was something that was very live for members, and due to a little bit of kind of transparency, public nature of LGPS funds, have been a few years ahead of others in experiencing some of that and what it means. And many of you may remember the Extinction Rebellion storming of the stage at LA conference not so long ago. But coming back to the barriers and the things that we found that funds and investors were struggling with were poor quality and inconsistent reporting, too many definitions and standards and acronyms, a lack of resource or expertise on climate change in many places, within fund managers, within consultants, within funds themselves. There was a challenge around unclear expectations of service providers too, and also a less specific issue for DB funds, but for some pooled funds, a challenge with influencing through voting. Questions about choice around ESG assets. Is there enough? What do they suit investor needs in all cases? and some of the challenges around communicating climate investment issues with members. Quite often the public conversation can be relatively black and white, and things are often much more complex in practice. So we came up with 7 recommendations on the back of the work that we have done with members, and those were focused around clarifying definitions of climate aware investing. We think it would be very helpful to have a common taxonomy, common definitions, common reporting frameworks. What we heard coming back very clearly was that there's a real variety, and it's very difficult to navigate through and do like-for-like comparisons. So if we can do something to resolve that, that would be incredibly helpful, and I'll come on to that in the next slides. Addressing the kind of poor quality of climate data and information, a mixture of those reporting elements and also those questions of equivalence. We're very keen to see that there is a greater equivalence of reporting and usage through the investment chain of TCFD, and we're heading in that direction. Ways to deliver greater climate expertise and education through the regulator, through guidance, through education, through consultancies, and then looking at how we can articulate our requirements of our intermediaries and managers more clearly. And that's an area we're doing some direct work currently with the Investment Association. Enabling better climate stewardship, which is certainly rising up the agenda and is very hot on the Minister for Pensions agenda. You may have seen with the recent consultation launched on what our scheme is doing on the S element, and there's some more news on that coming later in the summer. Improving the supply of climate products, whether that's green gilts or whether that's simply better products in the existing typical spaces and what those can be. And the response from the market seems to be positive, but still some awkward questions around greenwashing to be answered by many. And communication, what can we do to help with communication to members, whether that's through guidance, implementation statements, whether that's something in the kind of quality mark space that the PLSA is looking at. So those are our 7 recommendations. There's been some really good progress. So let's move to the next slide and just see what that looks like. So this is quite a busy slide, but I just wanted to kind of call out some of the kind of key elements. This is the roadmap that the government published at the beginning of November, back end of last year. And to date, they seem to be doing quite well and trying to keep to the roadmap. So what we've got is a phased rollout of obligations around TCFD, which will mean by 24, 25, the majority of the market, listed companies and non-listed, some wider non-listed companies and managers will all be using TCFD as a reporting mechanism. And there is some scope within here to look at whether lessons are learned as we go along. There's a big recognition that this is a highly evolving area, and also that it would be useful to kind of take stock on how those who are experiencing it at the front end, whether there are things that need to be picked up. But as you can see, there's quite a lot going on and the pace is reasonably fast. And I think the question and the challenge for investors is there is a lot of intermediation clearly through the chain. And so we have to be quite mindful of all the things that are happening in different parts simultaneously. And there are many other things that we're also focusing our work on. But that's the kind of roadmap. It's beginning to be kept to quite well. And so we'll move on into some of the next slide, into some of the other areas that are bubbling up. I've got my ordering of the slides wrong in my memory. So maybe just to come back to the TCFD. So one of the elements of TCFD is a rollout for the LGPS. And at the moment, the LGPS is sort of penciled in to have full TCFD obligations by 2023. So that is, given the size of the funds, that is later than some of the bigger private sector funds. and allows more time for consideration and interaction. So what we can move to the next slide now, sorry. So clearly a lot of funds are already reporting against TCFD. I think that's one thing that we should probably call out. And a lot of administering authorities have gone quite far or even further than the obligations on the kind of Paris climate Paris climate promises. There are many that have got 2030, 2035 net zero obligations or commitments. But one of the things that has been set up in order to kind of help support this issue more broadly, and also how the TCFD obligations get transferred through into the LGPS more generally, is a responsible investment advisory group that's currently sitting under the Scheme Advisory Board for England and Wales, and no doubt there will be continuing conversations for other devolved administrations, and Richard will clearly be able to share his perspective from Scotland. But I just want to quickly summarise. The group has only recently been set up, so it's had its first meeting. Primarily, we were discussing some of those kind of setup questions, what happens next. But these are the members of the group, in case you hadn't seen them. There's some more detail available on the LGPS website too. But it is intended to be a balance between administering authorities, pools, consultants, managers, other experts from private sector sphere, including one of my former teammates and colleague, Caroline Escott, who's now at RPMI. It's a small world. But the group is beginning to get into the meat of the work. We recognise that the pace is going to be pretty fast over the coming weeks and months and year because of the degree of regulatory change and the degree of interest. So we're going to be meeting every 6 weeks for the foreseeable future. And a couple of things that we're looking at in the first instance are an A to Z guide, an online guide, which will be a resource that will be available to kind of dip into, look at what are the terms, relevant terms, what are the case studies, what are the kind of key things that I need to be thinking about in terms of responsible investment. And those easy access resources are always very helpful. Longer term, we're looking at the transition of the TCFD obligations that have been mooted for the private sector into the LGPS, what that looks like, whether that looks a bit different for particular reasons. There are, as we saw on the previous slide, there are phases on scale. So I guess the question is, does the LGPS as one scheme but multiple funds look to move at once? Does it look to move based on scale? And what does that mean in different pockets, and how might that be rolled out? And how might we learn from kind of best practice that's already happening, given that there are many that are already doing a huge amount and have been for some while. So that's a very quick kind of dip into that work. We're really pleased to be participating, and we'll be kind of looking to share our fuller experience. And we can come back to questions on that. So next slide, please. So I think it's very helpful just to draw on some of the other things that are kind of happening in the sphere, because there is so much. And I think, making sure that you're kind of aware of the big things and where the connections might come through. So in March, we saw the implementation of the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. That might be the basis for the taxonomy that comes into the UK that the Chancellor promised in November. That's working in Europe now. That's got some pretty heavy changes in it, and certainly in terms of cleaning up some of the elements of greenwashing, elements of remuneration, incentives around TCFD built into managers' structures, and all sorts of other things. It's very big. Managers have been doing it in Europe. It's been a slog. So the question is, when does that come to the UK or something very similar? So worth having a look at that. We're expecting very soon, could be this week, could be next week, nice Easter present, a climate strategy from the pensions regulator. And that will be setting out how it is going to look to regulate the community in relation to both climate change reporting, some of the elements of the pension schemes bill that will come through later this year. And it's looking at these things mainly through a lens of governance rather than investment. So that will clearly catch local authority funds within that limited scope that it has. We've just seen a BEIS consultation on premium listings, so that's out. The Pensions Minister has just done a call for evidence asking funds to explain how are you taking into account S factors, those social factors in ESG, and no doubt that debate will become more live again in the LA space as well. I mentioned earlier some changes in the stewardship space. We're expecting a council of asset owners to be created in the summer. That's something that we're very much looking forward to kind of participating in. It's an opportunity to talk about best practice, share experiences, and also cascade down to smaller funds and schemes. That's still kind of being worked up behind the scenes, but that is coming in due course. Question about that taxonomy. More to come on whether consultants get caught by TCFD obligations post the CMA review, some of that. Restoring trust in audit, a mammoth consultation put out about 10 days ago, 250 pages if you've got some spare time to read it. But lots of big questions, but some of those are particularly about where do shareholders get greater rights, both in audit and other elements of company behaviour, with future promises to potentially look at both the stewardship code and the corporate governance code in order to reform those and make those a little bit tighter. More broadly, accounting standards with the IFRS being looked at to try and get to common ways of reporting in accounts for climate-related issues. So a lot going on, and we're engaging with nearly all of this. So I'm very happy to, and we'll be asking for your views. So, and just to give you the kind of heads up and to note that there's some easy resources just on the next slide which we can share after the session. If you want to just kind of dip into things and see where things are, please have a look at those. So Ellie, happy to run through to the final slide. So yeah, these are all on our website. If you can't find them, just get in touch and we'll send them over. I'll stop there, James. I know I've gone for a while.
No, that's fine, Joe. Great summary, and great to see that you're on the Responsible Investing Advisory Group, and many of our members well represented on that as well. Richard, what's your perspective on these issues?
Okay, James, I guess I was asked to do this because whenever we go around the table at the Local Authority Committee on issues top of our inbox, perennially climate change is at the top of my inbox. And I was thinking about why that is. There's various reasons for it, I think. Perhaps it's because it's the single biggest economic and existential issue of the 21st century, including COVID. But I don't actually think that is it. I think it's more because it's, and Joe hinted at this, it's such an emotionally charged issue. I think that's what keeps it as a troublesome issue, and it's probably the most troublesome issue I face as well. So the emotional charge around it. In fact, when I was asked to do the webinar, it was with the line, Richard, you're passionate about climate change, will you do our webinar? Now, I categorically deny being passionate about climate change. I like to think I'm rational about climate change, and in particular, I'm rational about climate change and its potential impact on paying pensions, because that's my job. And in that context, actually, I find TCFDs really useful in that if you're looking for a rational, logical framework to set out how you're thinking about climate change and what you're doing about climate change, then the TCFDs are probably it. So again, Joe suggested that although they're not mandatory yet, a lot of LGPS funds have had a go at them. We had our first go at them 2 years ago, updated last year, and we'll update a bit more thoroughly, I think, this year. There's probably nothing unique in our disclosures. I think most funds are doing different combinations of the same sort of things. There's possibly a few quirks in the things we do, One of them I was thinking about, I guess, under governance, which is where this TCFDs start. For us and for most funds, climate change started as part of the in ESG. But we made a conscious decision last year at committee to treat it separately. So not just part of ESG, but to treat it as a risk in its own right. I was asked at the committee meeting what that meant, and I didn't entirely know then, and I still don't entirely know, but I think it is the right approach. And it means things, for instance, like scenario modeling, which are part of the TCFDs. Board diversity is a really important issue within ESG, but we don't do scenario modeling for it. We do scenario modeling for climate change, and we've just completed our first scenario analysis, which will be part of the enhancement of our TCFD disclosures this year. So I think that's what makes climate change different. It's bigger and it's more fundamental than other ESG risks. Other things in our disclosures, as I say, is a different combination of what others do. So engagement still central to it, both on our own behalf, through investment managers, through our agent, through the various collaborative groups we're part of, so IIGCC, LAPFF, various others. We have an impact portfolio with a capacity of $1.5 billion. It has various impacts. Partly it's local, partly it's some social issues, but mostly it's environmental and climate change. On risk, mostly I think that's an investment manager responsibility, but we are looking ourselves at our choice of index for our passive portfolios, which are currently market cap and RAFI. And seeing if we're happy, I guess, with the risk exposure to climate change that we have within that, and we may do something on that later in the year. And lastly, under TCFD's metrics, we've had, I think, 2 or 3 iterations now at carbon footprinting, and we'll do that again this year. We haven't yet set a target, and I think that will be one of the additions we make this year. We will be more explicit in the target that we're measuring ourselves against. And that will, I think we'll have a more complete TCFD disclosure this year, though I think it will always be a work in progress. Particularly, again, Joe hinted that the requirement, once it becomes mandatory for LGPS, may be slightly different, so we may have to adapt for that. I don't know if our disclosures are currently to audit standard. The audit bar may be lifted higher once they're mandatory, so things like that will keep them developing, I think. But for just now, we find them a really helpful framework actually to bring together what we're doing and actually to cut out some of the noise. As Joe's slides showed, there's so much going on and so much noise. TCFDs allow you to focus, on where you are and where you're concentrating your effort. Only other thing, I guess I should mention COP26. Yes, COP26 is happening in Glasgow. Yes, therefore, I expect to be close to it physically. But beyond that, I have no real expectation of how it will pan out, of what, if any, our involvement will be. I guess we all hope for great things from COP26. It's not a pensions conference, it's a government conference. And locally, I guess the great hope is that from next year, instead of being Paris aligned, you'll all have to be Glasgow aligned, which can't be a bad thing. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Richard. We always try to be Glasgow aligned across the PLSA. Take that as read. Thank you. We look forward to your sort of local observers report on COP26. We've got a few minutes for questions, folks, so do please type your questions into the Q&A box so I can put them to Joe and Richard. But I'm going to start with 1 or 2 of my own. I mean, one of the things I hear all the time when I speak to our members, LAs, or indeed in the private sector funds about climate change is this issue about the complexity of reporting requirements and what you just described, Richard, as the noise. And you said that TCFD helps a bit because it gives you something to focus on. One of the recommendations of our report that Joe showed at the start to policymakers was to simplify all this. And I wonder, Joe, do you think that the policymakers sort of get that point about the need for simplifying? Because your slide on what else is happening was a very long slide.
Thanks, James. I think they are sympathetic to the cause. I think the question they have is a little bit a question of bandwidth. And there is, as you see, there's quite a lot that they're doing already. There's got a lot that they're thinking about in advance of COP, and there might be more noise, I think, and more regulatory promises ahead of that. And clearly, the UK will want to be seen as a leading light and demonstrating good practice. So, I think we'll see quite a lot of initiatives kind of across the piece. I think at the moment they've said that they're not going to get there yet. I think if we translate SFRD into the UK regulatory framework, that will probably take us quite a long way to solving some of the questions about the taxonomy. There are elements that we need to help ourselves with as well as an industry. There are lots of competing industry initiatives taking place, or things that have got the same goals but have got different labels. And a little bit of that is creating a bit of muddies the waters a little bit. If you're not kind of involved with this regularly, it just feels like there's another acronym, there's another thing. So there's a task for us to kind of help simplify that and explain it. But longer term, we will need to settle on some more common frameworks and more common ways of measuring things. And if I pick the example of cost transparency, which I also work on, that took us quite a long time to get there. There is an added regulatory incentive in this area to move faster. So I think we may move faster, but it isn't going to be necessarily easy, and has to work through that intermediated chain. It has to work for funds, intermediaries, managers, companies, the company audits, the company accounts. Doing all of those things is hard. Let's not quibble about it. That is hard to do. So there's a in a few years' time, I think we'll get there. The regulator, I think, has intimated both in its guidance and its public statements, it's going to accept best endeavours for the time being, certainly on some of the reporting, some of the metrics. That's helpful to some extent, but it's also makes life a bit messy sometimes, because if there's a difference in what best endeavours might be interpreted as, that causes other problems. And there's a slightly more, kind of reputational question, because if people are reporting, and they have to report now, in public statements about how they're approaching things, it will be easy for people to compare apples with pears about approaches and how far people are going, and completely misunderstand what is happening, because the metrics will be different, the approaches will be different, and that will be hugely misleading, or has a risk of being hugely misleading for both reputation of the industry and for savers and for funds as well. So there's a lot in there, but I think we'll get there, but it'll take a little bit of time.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And Richard, I wanted to ask you a different question. You said that for you, climate change is really an emotional issue, but also a rational one. And I guess it is quite an emotional one for many of your members and those who are contacting you and campaigning. What kind of information do you find members are asking for about what the fund's doing on climate change and responsible investment?
Yeah, the members tend to be focused very much on fossil fuel divestment. And that's because so many loud voices shout for that Extinction Rebellion. Friends of the Earth recently published a report on the LGPS. In fact, there's a motion going tomorrow to Glasgow City Council, my administering authority, from the Green Party, calling on the fund to divest from fossil fuel. And that, I'm sure there'll be some fairly emotive debate at Council tomorrow. And the motion itself, to my mind, isn't entirely logical. There's a bit of a leap of logic in it, in that COP26 is happening in Glasgow, therefore divestment is the only solution. Our response to that is actually a summary version of the TCFDs. And I think that's been fairly effective to date. So we're effectively saying, look, it's not this binary decision. You can't just do that and it's sorted. Here are all the things we're doing. And here's the logical governance strategy, risk, metrics approach that we're taking. And that seems to be allaying them so far, but only up to a point.
Okay, and one question to Joe. Joe, you briefly referred to the work that the advisory group is going to be producing. How can, and you're obviously on the group contributing to that. How can our members contribute to that process? Is that via you or directly?
Yeah, so members can send through comments directly through me. I'm happy to feed those through into the working group. They can do that via the Scheme Advisory Board too, or through the routes that kind of on the website. There are a couple of things that we're will be particularly seeking feedback on. That is, are the questions about some of the definitions that kind of emerge? Are there missing things? When I look at the definitions, it always makes me think of the sort of scene in one of the Blackadders when Johnson has turned up with the dictionary and Baldrick rolls in and goes, "Oh, do you want some sausages or something?" And he goes, "Oh, I haven't got sausages in the dictionary." And it will be like that for a little bit. We'll want to make sure that we capture the kind of key elements, whether there are links that can be helpful, whether there are case studies. I'm particularly kind of keen to have case studies on there. So the examples of the things that you're doing, or things that you'd like to see covered in forms of case studies, that will also be helpful because, the idea is to make it quite interactive and useful ultimately, so you can just go and find most of the things that you kind of need.
Great, thanks, Joe. Well, we look forward to that, and good to know your door's open to contributions from our members. Remarkably, we're not getting flooded with questions from attendees, which I assume is a sort of vote of confidence in what you've been saying, but it's right on the money. I wanted to ask you both one or two questions about some of the other stuff that the PLSA is working on, because climate change is not the only issue on our agenda. And I know that our local authority committee, and Richard, you're a member of that, I know you're beavering away on a whole array of issues. So one of those is contributing to the good governance project that the Scheme Advisory Board is doing. And I think, Joe, you sit on the panel for that. I know it's very much an England and Wales sort of project, but I think Richard in Scotland is keeping an eye on it. Joe, maybe you can say a little bit about where that has got to and what's your role with it.
Yeah, thanks, James. So the Good Governance Project has more or less come to a kind of formal conclusion now. It's been running for a while. Very pleased to have participated in both the discussion, the Scheme Advisory Board, where I'm an advisor, but also the subgroups with many of our members and many of the colleagues from around the local authority committee table who also took part in those discussions. So we're looking really at next phases for implementation now. What does it mean in terms of some of the kind of key measures that are going to be necessary and helpful to understand whether good governance structures are kind of in place? I think one of the elements that came through very clearly from a lot of the work is that it's quite a variety of approaches to getting to the right place across the local authority sector. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all measure, but there are certain common measures and common ways of articulating what is happening that are very helpful in understanding where responsibility lies, how decisions are made, what kind of resources and support is necessary, is there, is going to be forthcoming. And I think, one of the big questions that kind of we started the project with was, okay, well, how do we understand what's happening? What does good governance look like? But also, how do we measure and ensure that the right structures are in place going forward? And people have the support. I think one of the key drivers, which is important, which came through, some of our talent management work a couple of years ago as well, is, people often have good structures, but they're also a little bit short on resourcing and support to get the relevant resourcing. And what a lot of the work does is kind of demonstrate, actually, if you're going to run something well, this is the kind of structures that you might look to have in place. And then, okay, measure what those are and what else you need. And I think that really helps articulate to some extent need and gives a really good case for saying, actually, if we want to have good governance, we will need these sorts of elements in order to run this fund properly. And that does flush up other questions, which are difficult, certainly, where administering authorities have been squeezing on budgets and resourcing. So I think it's going to be really helpful for that kind of dynamic. And no doubt that discussion is going to be quite tricky in the next year or two as we look at overall kind of government budget allocations.
Thanks, Joe. And we've got one or two questions coming in now on at last on climate change. I'm going to circle back to those because I want to just cover a couple of other topics. One of which is the pensions dashboard, and I know that's, Joe, that's very high on our sort of priority list for our policy work. It's going to affect all our members. But perhaps first, Richard, what's your perspective on the dashboard, and how prepared do you feel Strathclyde are? What are you looking for to help you prepare?
Yeah, okay. So the dashboard's a good thing. It's officially a good thing. It will be helpful to savers and scheme members, and that can only be a good thing. However, whenever I look, in principle, it's quite a simple thing, but as ever, the devil's in the detail. And, whenever I've looked at the data spec for it, it just makes my head hurt. So to that extent, I'm very grateful for the work of others on it, not least the PLSA, in coordinating the effort on it and the local authority effort. I mean, I think a lot of the effort for local government will be central, but then we'll all have to make sure that we're delivering ourselves. Like everything else, it's to achieve a good outcome is just an awful lot of work in detail, but we'll put that work in.
Yeah, great, thanks. And Joe, where are we up to on the dashboard?
Yeah, thanks, James. So dashboard is also another one of our major priority projects for the year, and no doubt will be for kind of future years, given the kind of period of rollout that we're looking at. It is an area that's come up quite a lot in discussion with local authority members about the challenge of getting data ready, and there are different challenges for traditional and LADB schemes versus those who are in DC. Charge benefits, GMPs, not to mention the challenge of the cloud and all the other elements that we're having to deal with in the next couple of years. But we're heavily engaged. We think there's been probably a little bit less engagement than we would like from those running some of the projects and MHCLG with local authorities about what it means, how to engage, some of the expectations. We're meeting with the department in order to help resolve some of that in due course. We have been running a coordination group to look at some of those questions that kind of Richard flushed out, like what are the big issues in terms of implementation? How do people feel about the data standards? How do people feel about the levels of security and the information sharing and some of the requirements that you might have in that space? If you're listening and you think, oh, that's something I'd like to find out more about, please do contact us. We have the coordination group is a mixed group. It's got local authority funds, private sector schemes on there too. We're keen to get as much member feedback in this space as possible. We have got a webinar, I believe, coming up in a couple of weeks to cover it off, or come later this spring, to looking at it more. So please do participate in that. And we're also looking to host and coordinate some more dashboard project group, PLSA member sort of engagement together, so we can talk about these issues in a much more kind of open and more fulsome way, because there's a lot going on. The digital dashboard consultations are pretty detailed and quite long sometimes. It's easy, and they're quite often periods of consultation are not so long, so there's a lot to always try and keep up with. So we want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to see and understand what's going on and to engage. And we, of course, we'll be feeding that all through back as members of the dashboard steering group, which we are, Nigel People, our Director of Policy and Advocacy, is a member of.
Yeah, that's great. I know, I know Nigel's representing us very well on that. That's good. And Joe, I know one other big project you and your team are very busy on is a piece of research into the future of the LGPS landscape. I guess we'll start to hear a lot more about that work over the next year, but can you briefly summarise what that's about?
Yes, thanks, James. So this is something that we've been discussing at quite some depth with our local authority committee, and something which we're looking to run quite a substantial project on during the course of this year. We will be coming to members for feedback for both case studies, surveys and questionnaires. So watch out for that. That will be coming to you in the next couple of months. But sort of to give you some genesis of what we're looking at, we are looking at really kind of quite a detailed examination of some of the core issues and core areas of importance for funds. We're going to be looking at kind of questions around budget and resourcing, administration, communication to members, talent management, the guidance and role of regulation from TPR and MHCLG, as well as how do we future-proof the LGPS in order to make sure that it is sustainable and goes in the direction that we want it to do. What are those kind of big things that we'd like to potentially help to do that? In the past, I've had lots of conversations with members about simplifying structures in order to make some of the admin easier, certainly after we've gone through all the palaver and grief of McLeod. But we're going to be examining these issues, understanding kind of member perspectives, actually, what are people doing, what are case studies, what are the things you'd really want to change in some of these areas, and reporting back later in the year. But big piece of engagement coming through later in the year, so please do watch out for that, and there'll be some more on that at our local authority conference in May.
Okay, thanks, Joe. We'll look forward to hearing that. Now, we do have a couple of questions on climate change, which will come through at last. So let's quickly skate through those before we finish. Richard, perhaps one for you from Peter Wallach, who asks, can you comment on the feasibility or scope of moving the climate debate from the negatives of fossil fuel divestment, etc., to the positives of investing in mitigation or adaptation?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important part of what we do. Certainly, I said we have an impact portfolio, which with capacity for $1.5 billion. And I think, thinking ahead to COP26, and I said I don't know how it'll pan out, but we're very clear that one of the things we have to do is get our PR better ahead of it. And I think featuring all the good stuff that we're doing in that portfolio will be a really important part of that. We're collating information just now, which we should be gathering more regularly, but on the impact measurement of that portfolio specifically. It's an uphill struggle, though. An awful lot of the audience are certainly initially resistant to the positive message around this. I think there will be huge opportunities around climate change investment. And the thing I talked about, where we're treating it as a separate issue, we're treating it as a separate risk and opportunity, and that was explicit in what was agreed by the committee last year. But I think there's probably work to do to make the rest of the world see it that way. But I don't know. I feel the sand shifting on that already. And I think there is a better understanding that it's about opportunity as well as risk. But we need to do everything we can to foster that, I guess.
Thanks, Richard. And Joe, it may just have to be a 2-sentence answer from you on another question, which is, should a LGPS fund that hasn't started on this journey begin working on a TCFD document now, or wait for the MHCLG regulations?
I think it's worth, take it on yourselves, but I think it's worth having a look now, because even if the MHCLG regulations come through later, it may be that you want to do something in advance, and also it depends on where you are in if in your journey, essentially. If there's a degree of needing to get up to speed on things, the earlier you start, the earlier that you can think about things, you can think about them in a more strategic way, because otherwise you might get caught coming to it very late in future.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe, and thanks also, Richard. We are just about out of time, so thank you both of you for your excellent contributions, covering a pretty wide range of issues we've covered, as well as climate change in the last few minutes. We've got more of these policy insight webinars specifically for our local authority members coming up. They're on the 8th of July and the 24th of November. So put those in your diaries, same time, 11 o'clock. And if there are particular topics you'd like us to cover in those, please drop me a line. We also have one for all our members on the dashboard, which Joe briefly mentioned. That's on the 10th of June. I should also plug our local authority conference, which is coming up 18th and 19th of May. Do please register for that. We'll be covering everything from McLeod to GMPs to resourcing. We'll have Tim Shipman from the Sunday Times talking about the political landscape. And we'll have Nick Gannon from TPR talking about the new single code, which he did a session on for us yesterday. And if you missed that, then the recording will be available, or come along and hear him at the LA conference. So that's the few plugs there, a few things to look forward to. Thank you again very much indeed to Richard and Joe. Thanks for everyone for dialing in, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.